You wake up every morning, look in the mirror, and the belly fat is still there. Even though you ate light last night, even though you slept enough, even though you might be fasting. And you start wondering, what am I doing wrong? Here's the uncomfortable truth most people never hear. It's not last night's dinner that decides belly fat. It's the first 45 minutes of your morning. In today's video, we're going to uncover a powerful biological reality. Visceral fat does not respond to extreme effort. It responds to cortisol. And the way you start your morning may already be programming your body to store fat before you've even taken your first bite of food. The title of today's video is Drop Morning Cortisol: How to Force Your Body to Burn Visceral Fat Naturally. This is not a motivation video. It's not a productivity routine, and it's definitely not another try harder message. What you're about to learn is a physiology-based protocol grounded in hormones, the nervous system, and circadian biology designed to help your body feel safe enough to release stored energy instead of clinging to it. If you wake up tired but feel wired at night, need coffee immediately just to function, struggle with stubborn belly fat despite your efforts, this video is for you. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and watch until the end, because fixing your morning doesn't just change your day, it changes how your body burns fat over time. The core reason belly fat doesn't decrease even after a full night of sleep and hours without food has very little to do with discipline or willpower. It comes down to a small but extremely influential window: the first 45 to 60 minutes after you wake up. During this time, your body is not automatically burning fat. Instead, it is doing something far more important: assessing the environment to decide one critical question. Is it safe today to spend energy, or should we conserve it? The answer to that question is largely determined by a hormonal mechanism known as the cortisol awakening response, or CAR. This response is completely natural. Cortisol rises in the morning to help you wake up, focus, and mobilize energy. From an evolutionary perspective, this spike prepared humans to move, hunt, and survive. The problem is not that cortisol rises. The problem is how long it stays elevated and how it is amplified by modern habits. In an optimal biological state, morning cortisol rises sharply and then falls relatively quickly. When this happens, the body receives a clear signal. The environment is stable. Energy can be used. This is the state in which fat, including visceral fat, becomes an accessible fuel source. But for most people, the opposite occurs. The moment we wake up, we introduce unnecessary stress signals: artificial blue light from screens, caffeine before hydration, rushing, negative information, social comparison. These signals do not enhance cortisol's function, they destabilize it. Instead of rising and falling, cortisol remains elevated. And to the body, this is no longer a wake-up signal. It is a threat signal. When the body perceives threat, it will never prioritize burning visceral fat. From a biological standpoint, visceral fat is not excess. It is protective tissue surrounding vital organs, such as the liver, intestines, and kidneys. To regulate this tissue, the body equips it with a high density of stress-sensitive receptors. When cortisol is high, these receptors activate fat storage enzymes. The message is unmistakable. This is not the time to store resources. This explains why overnight fasting alone often fails to reduce belly fat. Fasting does not automatically equal fat burning if hormonal signals indicate danger. In biology, signals always outweigh effort. The body does not respond to how hard you try, it responds to what you communicate through physiology. What makes this particularly important is that these signals are sent before you eat or exercise. Within the first hour of the day, the nervous system sets the metabolic tone for the entire morning, often for the entire day. Once this survival mode is activated, even healthy meals are more likely to be stored rather than used. This is why focusing only on food choices, fasting duration, or workout intensity while ignoring the way your day begins often leads to frustration. Belly fat is not stubborn because you lack discipline. It is resistant because your body is doing exactly what it was designed to do under perceived stress. And this is where the next part of the video becomes essential: understanding how to send safety signals to the nervous system in the morning, allowing cortisol to do its job and then step aside. When that happens, fat loss is no longer a battle, it becomes a natural biological outcome. Morning cortisol has such a powerful impact on belly fat, not because cortisol is inherently harmful, but because visceral fat is biologically designed to listen to cortisol more closely than any other fat tissue in the body. Visceral fat contains 3 to 4 times more glucocorticoid receptors, stress receptors, than subcutaneous fat. This means that even a small stress signal is amplified at the level of visceral fat, triggering an immediate response. When cortisol rises, especially in the morning, it does more than influence alertness or mood. It activates a key enzyme called lipoprotein lipase, LPL, the enzyme responsible for pulling energy out of the bloodstream and locking it into fat cells. Under high cortisol conditions, LPL shifts the body towards storage rather than expenditure. And because visceral fat has a higher density of stress receptors, it becomes the most protected and aggressively stored fat depot. Morning is the time when the body is most vulnerable to this process. After a full night without food or water, the body wakes up mildly but chronically dehydrated. Simply breathing during sleep results in significant fluid loss. As a result, blood viscosity increases, circulation becomes more demanding, and the cardiovascular system experiences subtle physical stress, even if you don't consciously feel it. At the same time, the brain is completing its overnight cleanup process. The glymphatic system has just cleared metabolic waste, and the nervous system is transitioning between states. During this window, the brain is exceptionally sensitive to environmental input. In other words, small signals are easily misinterpreted as large threats. This is why seemingly harmless morning habits carry outsized biological consequences. Checking your phone exposes your eyes to artificial blue light that sends confusing signals to the brain. The light is too weak to properly set circadian timing, but strong enough to trigger low-grade alertness and anxiety. Cortisol remains elevated instead of declining naturally. Drinking coffee immediately after waking, before proper hydration, further amplifies this stress response. Caffeine has a mild diuretic effect, worsening dehydration while the adrenal system is still highly sensitive. Instead of supporting physiological wakefulness, early caffeine pushes cortisol beyond its functional range, signaling emergency rather than readiness. Even turning on bright artificial lighting early in the morning disrupts cortisol regulation. These lights lack the intensity and spectrum required to anchor circadian rhythms, yet still stimulate the sympathetic nervous system. The result is prolonged cortisol elevation rather than a clean rise and fall pattern. When cortisol remains elevated, visceral fat responds exactly as it was designed to. It locks down energy reserves. This is not resistance to fat loss, it is survival biology. The body does not know you are trying to lose weight. It only knows whether the environment feels safe or unstable. And in an unstable environment, burning visceral fat is a risk the body will not take. This is why belly fat is not determined by what you eat first in the morning, but by the stress signals you send to your body before you eat at all. And that is why the morning, more than any other time of day, becomes the biological gateway to reducing visceral fat. If visceral fat is locked by morning cortisol, the solution is not to force the body to burn more fat, but to send clear safety signals that allow the body to unlock it naturally. That is the core philosophy behind the morning routine presented in this video. Not motivation, not discipline, but biological signaling. The routine introduces 5 key signals that tell the body one simple but powerful message. The environment is stable, there is no immediate threat, energy can be used. The first and most foundational signal is hydration and minerals, often referred to as the adrenal cocktail. When you wake up, before coffee and before screens, your body is already in a subtle deficit. After 7-8 hours without water, the issue isn't just low energy, it's dehydration and mineral depletion. Continuous breathing during sleep leads to fluid loss, reducing blood volume and increasing blood viscosity. To the cardiovascular and nervous systems, this represents a mild but persistent physical stress. Thicker blood requires more effort from the heart to circulate. The nervous system interprets this increased demand as a survival signal. The natural response? Elevated cortisol, Not because you're in danger, but because biology cannot distinguish modern lifestyle stress from ancestral survival stress. This is why immediate hydration is critical. But water alone is not enough. The adrenal glands responsible for cortisol production depend on mineral balance, especially sodium and potassium. When sodium levels are low, the body compensates by increasing stress hormones like aldosterone and adrenaline to maintain blood pressure. This creates a baseline stress state before the day even begins. Adding a pinch of high-quality sea salt or Himalayan salt to warm water in the morning is not a wellness gimmick. It is a direct biological signal. It tells the kidneys and adrenal glands that resources are available. When sodium is restored at the right time, baseline stress responses soften, and cortisol no longer needs to remain elevated. A squeeze of lemon can provide a small amount of potassium and support liver function not for detox, but for metabolic coordination. Together, these signals help stabilize internal physiology within minutes of waking. And only when internal stability is restored does the body consider releasing stored energy rather than protecting it. This is precisely why coffee should not be the first thing you consume. Caffeine has a mild diuretic effect and stimulates the stress axis. When introduced into a dehydrated, mineral-depleted system, it doesn't support wakefulness, it amplifies threat signals. Cortisol rises not to enhance performance, but to cope. And in coping mode, visceral fat remains locked. This hydration and mineral step may seem simple, but biologically, it forms the foundation of the entire morning. When the first signal the body receives is stability and support, every signal that follows light exposure, movement, caffeine timing, and food is interpreted differently. This is not a small habit. It is the way you establish communication with your nervous system from the very first minutes of the day. Step 2. The light signal, resetting the circadian clock. If hydration and minerals tell the body that resources are available, then morning light tells it that the timing is right. And in biology, timing matters as much as action. Within the first 30 minutes after waking, the brain needs a very specific signal to set the rhythm for the entire day. Not all light can do this. Only natural sunlight carries the intensity and spectral information the nervous system is designed to recognize. Morning light directly influences a deep brain control center that governs when cortisol is released, when melatonin is produced, and whether the body should spend energy or conserve it. When natural light enters the eyes early in the day, it sends a clear message. This is morning. Activate the system. Cortisol rises sharply to promote alertness. But more importantly, it is scheduled to fall quickly. This clean rise and fall pattern is what most people are missing. Cortisol is not harmful when it rises at the right time and declines on schedule. In fact, a properly shaped morning cortisol curve leads to stable energy, mental clarity, and critically, a body that feels safe enough to burn fuel. In this state, visceral fat no longer needs to remain in a defensive posture, because the nervous system has been reassured that the day-night cycle is intact. Morning sunlight also stimulates the production of serotonin. While often labeled the feel-good neurotransmitter, serotonin plays a much deeper biological role. It is the precursor to melatonin, the hormone that governs sleep. In other words, your exposure to light in the morning programs your sleep at night. When serotonin is produced adequately during the day, melatonin is released at the right time after sunset, leading to deeper sleep, better recovery, and a more stable cortisol response the following morning. This creates a self-reinforcing biological loop, with light as the entry point. When mornings begin instead with LED lighting or phone screens, the brain receives a conflicting signal. Artificial light tends to be low in intensity but rich in blue wavelengths. It is too weak to firmly establish morning in the brain, yet stimulating enough to trigger alertness. The result is a limbo state, not fully awake physiologically, but not relaxed either. Cortisol remains elevated instead of declining. In this state, the body never receives a clear signal that the day has started properly. Rather than a decisive activation followed by regulation, the hormone system stays on edge, waiting for danger. And as long as cortisol remains elevated, visceral fat continues to act as an emergency reserve regardless of how healthy your meals may be. Just 5 to 10 minutes outside, without sunglasses, without intense exercise, is enough to produce a profound biological effect. Even on cloudy days, outdoor light intensity far exceeds that of indoor lighting. What matters is not harsh sunlight, but the correct optical signal, one the human brain has evolved to interpret over hundreds of thousands of years. When the light signal is properly established, downstream systems begin to self-correct. Cortisol follows its natural curve, serotonin production stabilizes, melatonin timing improves, and the nervous system gradually shifts from defense to energy utilization. At that point, fat burning is no longer forced. It becomes a natural response to a body that perceives its environment as stable and safe. This is why the light step is not a small habit, but a biological switch. You don't need to do more. You simply need to be in the right place, at the right time, and allow light to do what it has always done best. Set the rhythm for the entire body. Step 3. The 90-minute caffeine rule. If morning light resets the hormonal clock, then caffeine timing determines whether that clock runs smoothly or stutters throughout the day. The issue is not whether coffee is good or bad, but when it is consumed. During the first 90 minutes after waking, the brain is still completing an essential biological process, clearing adenosine. Adenosine is a molecule that accumulates in the brain throughout the day as you expend energy. It creates sleep pressure, pushing the body toward rest. During sleep, the brain's cleaning systems begin flushing adenosine out of neural spaces, but this process does not end the moment you wake up. In the early morning window, residual adenosine is still being cleared. This is a transitional phase that requires a natural rise into wakefulness, not immediate stimulation. When coffee is consumed immediately upon waking, caffeine does not remove adenosine. Instead, it blocks adenosine receptors, masking the signal of fatigue. You feel alert quickly, but this alertness is artificial. Adenosine remains present, accumulating behind the blockade. Biologically, it's like putting a lid on a pressure cooker instead of turning off the heat. The consequences often appear later in the day. As caffeine levels drop in the early or mid-afternoon, the accumulated adenosine floods back onto receptors all at once. This produces the familiar energy crash, mental fog, low motivation, sugar cravings, and emotional volatility. At this point, the body experiences a sudden drop in available energy and activates a survival response. That response is cortisol release. Cortisol rises to compensate for falling alertness, allowing you to push through the rest of the day. But afternoon cortisol is different from morning cortisol. It is not designed to support sustained performance. It is meant for short-term crisis management. When cortisol rises at this time, it drives sugar cravings, destabilizes blood glucose, and promotes energy storage in the evening. This is how an early morning coffee can quietly influence belly fat later in the day. Crash cortisol, spike sugar, cravings, insulin fluctuations, fat storage, especially visceral fat. Coffee itself isn't the problem. Mistimed coffee disrupts circadian and hormonal rhythm. When you wait approximately 90 minutes after waking, a different sequence unfolds. Adenosine is cleared naturally. The cortisol awakening response completes its cycle and begins to decline. When caffeine is introduced at this point, it no longer masks fatigue. It functions as a performance enhancer rather than a crutch. Coffee now gently amplifies focus and reaction time without creating excessive stress. Energy becomes more stable. The crash is softened or eliminated. And most importantly, cortisol is no longer required to compensate later in the day. When cortisol stays lower in the afternoon, the cascade that promotes evening fat storage is interrupted. This reveals a key principle. The issue is not whether you need coffee, but whether you are using it to support physiology or fight it. In the first scenario, coffee becomes a strategic tool. In the second, it becomes an unseen disruptor. The 90-minute rule is not about deprivation. It is about allowing the body to complete a biological cycle before introducing stimulation. When this rhythm is respected, caffeine integrates smoothly into the day instead of destabilizing it. And when stress is reduced, the body no longer feels compelled to hold on to visceral fat as a protective reserve. Step 4. The safe movement signal, optic flow. After the body has received the signal of resource availability through hydration and minerals, and the signal of correct timing through morning light, the nervous system still needs one more answer. Are we moving in safety, or are we fighting for survival? The answer does not come from exercise intensity, but from how movement is perceived by the brain. This is why high-intensity training in the morning, especially HIIT, is not always the optimal choice for individuals under chronic stress or carrying high levels of visceral fat. HIIT sends a strong biological message. Oxygen demand spikes, heart rate accelerates rapidly, and energy needs surge. In a sensitized nervous system, this signal can be interpreted as threat. Rather than reducing stress, the body responds by increasing cortisol further to cope. And when cortisol rises in this context, visceral fat has even more reason to stay locked. The solution presented in the video is not inactivity, but the right kind of movement. Specifically, a 10-15-minute walk outdoors in the morning. What makes this walk powerful is not the calorie burn or step count, but a neural mechanism known as optic flow. When you walk forward and look ahead, the visual environment moves steadily across your field of vision. The brain doesn't just register this movement, it interprets it as a deeply ingrained signal of safety. Throughout human evolution, forward movement typically meant exploration, foraging, or migration under controlled conditions. Being frozen, cornered, or forced backward, on the other hand, often signaled danger. Optic flow is directly connected to the amygdala, the brain's fear and threat detection center. When optic flow is smooth and continuous, amygdala activity tends to decrease. This shift quiets the sympathetic fight-or-flight response and allows the parasympathetic rest and recover system to take over. As amygdala activity drops, cortisol levels follow. This is not a vague psychological effect. It is a precise biological response. The body receives a clear message. We are moving with purpose. We are not being chased. There is no immediate threat. In this state, emergency energy storage is unnecessary. Visceral fat gradually loses its role as a defensive reserve. Combining morning walking with natural light creates a powerful synergistic effect. Light resets circadian timing, while optic flow reassures the nervous system. One signal tells the body it is daytime. The other says we are safe while active. Together, they guide cortisol downward in an orderly, non-depleting way. By contrast, starting the day seated in front of a screen creates a biological mismatch. The brain receives intense informational stimulation, but the body remains physically still. This is a scenario human physiology was never designed to handle well. The brain perceives pressure without movement to resolve it. Cortisol stays elevated even in the absence of physical exertion. Morning walking, then, is not a fat-burning workout in the traditional sense. It is a neurological message. That message communicates control, rhythm, and direction. And only when this message is delivered does the body begin to consider using deep energy reserves like visceral fat. The subtle power of this step lies in its simplicity. You don't need to push harder. You simply need to move in a way the nervous system recognizes as safe. Once safety is established, fat loss is no longer blocked by defensive biology. It becomes a natural byproduct of movement rather than the result of force. Step 5. The mental shield. Delaying dopamine. If the previous 4 steps stabilize the body from the outside hydration, light, caffeine timing, and movement, this final step acts directly on the highest control center, the brain, because no matter how well the body is prepared, if the brain enters a reactive state early, the entire system can be pulled back into stress mode. And in the modern morning, the strongest trigger for this is the phone. During the first 30 minutes after waking, the brain is extremely sensitive. It has just transitioned out of sleep and is still calibrating its perception of the environment. It is essentially asking, how alert do I need to be today? When you immediately check social media, email, or messages, the brain is flooded with stimuli it did not choose. It does not differentiate between harmless information and threat. What it registers is uncontrolled input. Each notification, headline, or message activates dopamine, the neurotransmitter associated with motivation and attention. But dopamine released too early in the morning does not create stable focus. It induces a constant seeking state, pushing the brain into reaction mode. And biologically, reaction implies danger. When the brain perceives constant demands, the sympathetic nervous system activates. Cortisol rises alongside it, not to support healthy wakefulness, but to prepare for fight or flight. The problem is that this state does not resolve quickly. When the brain starts the day in a reactive, externally driven mode, it tends to remain there for hours, even after you step away from the screen. This highlights a critical but often overlooked point. The brain operates on neural momentum. It does not reset with each small task. The way you begin your morning sets the direction of that momentum. If the initial state is calm, proactive, and self-directed, cortisol has the opportunity to fall and stabilize. If the initial state is reactive, comparative, and anxious, cortisol remains elevated as a prolonged defense strategy. When cortisol stays high, the body shifts priorities. Fat burning and metabolic optimization are no longer relevant. Safety comes first, and biologically, safety often means conserving energy. Visceral fat remains protected not because you failed, but because the brain continues to signal instability. Delaying phone use for the first 30 minutes is not an exercise in harsh discipline. It is a neural shield. By withholding external dopamine input, the brain can establish its own internal rhythm. The natural cortisol awakening response completes its role and then subsides, instead of being prolonged by constant stimulation. In this screen-free window, the brain enters a proactive mode. You control the pace rather than algorithms. The parasympathetic nervous system has space to set a calm baseline. Once that baseline is established, later stressors work. Information. Unavoidable challenges are processed with significantly lower cortisol output. The key insight is subtle. You don't need to eliminate dopamine all day. You only need to delay it at the right time. When dopamine arrives after physiological stability is established, it becomes a positive motivator. When it arrives too early, it becomes fuel for stress. Step 5 is not anti-technology. It is about restoring biological order. Physiology first, information second. When this mental shield is in place, the entire morning protocol can function as intended. Hydration stabilizes internal balance. Light sets circadian timing. Caffeine enhances performance at the right moment. Safe movement calms the nervous system. And finally, the brain is not pulled into early reactivity, allowing cortisol to decline naturally. When all these signals align, fat burning is no longer blocked by defensive biology. It becomes the natural outcome of a morning designed in harmony with human physiology. The most important takeaway from this video is not any single habit, but how your body makes decisions. Your body does not burn fat because you force it to. It burns fat when the nervous system perceives the environment as safe enough to spend energy. And morning is the moment when that decision is made. The 5 steps you've learned are not isolated tricks. They form a structured sequence of biological signals. Hydration and minerals tell the body that resources are available. Natural light resets the day-night rhythm. Proper caffeine timing enhances performance without stress. Safe movement calms the fear center of the brain, and delaying dopamine allows the mind to start the day proactively rather than reactively. When these signals arrive in the right order, cortisol stops being the enemy. It returns to its intended role, rising when needed, stepping back when its job is done. And when cortisol is no longer chronically elevated, visceral fat no longer needs to act as an emergency reserve. Fat loss no longer requires force. It becomes the natural outcome of a balanced system. If you've ever felt frustrated because you were doing everything right, but belly fat wouldn't budge, understand this. You may not have been doing it wrong. You may simply have been sending the right signals at the wrong time. Biology does not reward blind effort. It responds to intelligent alignment. You don't need to overhaul your entire life. You only need to redesign your morning. When the morning changes, the rest of the day follows. Energy becomes steadier, cravings soften, sleep improves, and over time, the body begins to trust that it no longer needs to stay in defense mode. If this video helped you see your body through a new lens, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share it with anyone stuck in the cycle of fat loss, stress, and frustration. Here, we don't teach you to fight your body. We help you work with your biology, and that is the most sustainable way to change.